I could smell the gasoline before I could see the men. It was a sharp, oily breath that cut through the heat of the sun and turned the air sour. My shirt was wet, soaked, from the liquid they'd poured over me. My hands were tied behind my back. The rope bit into my wrists. Above the din of the crowd, someone was chanting. My heart hammered against my ribs like it wanted to break free. They were close enough that I could see the sweat on their faces, faces I had known since childhood. Men who had shared bread with my father, who had come to our house to ask counsel, to exchange greetings at the mosque. They circled me like vultures. Between their legs I could see the old square, the wooden post at its center, the pile of scrap beside it where they planned to build a fire. Their shouts blurred into a single flood of sound. I tried to push the memory of my own breathing into steadiness. I tried to find words. "Jesus, I trust you," I mouthed. The words were small. They were all I had. How did an imam's son end up here? That was the question that cut through me even as the mob's heat closed in. The answer had 1,000 slow steps. A memory of my father's hands lifting me to recite the Quran at dawn. A woman with a tired face bringing soup to our house. A doctor with calloused fingers who operated without taking money. A small paper-backed book wrapped in cloth and left on a table. A prayer whispered in the dark that felt like a hand resting on my head. It was a journey of faith that moved as quietly as a seed growing under the soil, until one day, it could not be hidden. If this story finds you, please subscribe and keep persecuted believers in your prayers. There are more like me whose lives depend on unseen courage and visible mercy. I was born into the mosque. My childhood smells were incense and the crisp sound of recitation. My father was imam, the kind of man whose words settled a room. People came to him with questions that they could not say aloud at home. Marriages, lands, disputes. My mother kept the house with a quiet diligence that made everyone feel welcomed. They expected me to take the path laid out for me. I learned to stand before a congregation and recite without flinching. I learned to hold my tongue when community honor mattered. To be the imam's son was to carry a map traced by generations. There was pride in that role. There was also a pressure like a stone balanced on the chest. Every misstep could be more than a personal failure. It could be a stain on the family's name. I memorized the holy words because it was expected of me. I observed the fasts, the prayers, the duties. I felt the approval in my father's eyes when I read with clarity. But approval can become a quiet cage. The things I was taught to fear were not always arguments with logic. They were warnings about being wrong, about being weak, about bringing shame. Love, in that world, was often tied to obedience. When the doctor came, he did not arrive with a parade. He came with a battered white Land Cruiser and a small woman at his side, Sarah, who smiled as if the sun had risen for no reason at all. They rented a room near the market and put up a sign saying they would treat anyone. At first the villagers watched them like wary birds. They were Christians, yes. We had been taught stories about outsiders with different beliefs. We knew what the book said about not mixing. Yet here they were, open as a door. My mother fell ill with something that would not relent. The fevers took her weight away slowly, the kind of illness that leaves a person looking smaller every day. We took her to the local healers first. We prayed and recited and fasted. There were nights when I sat at her bedside and listened to the shallow drift of her breath and felt the helplessness suffocate the house. My father's hands trembled when he called for the elders. There were ledger books and debts and a small town's pride. Surgery, an idea that tasted like both hope and shame, required more than we could muster. The Christian doctor pushed past whatever villagers feared and said plainly, "We will operate. We will not take money." He looked at my father and saw the reluctance there, the unspoken insistence against becoming beholden to outsiders. He said, "We do not want to change your minds. We only want your mother to live." That was the first thing that began to shift something in me. Not the words about salvation, but the simple, steady act of help. The doctor came early and scrubbed the wounds of our shame with the same careful hands he used in surgery. Sarah visited my mother after the operation. She cut the tea and sat down and listened to my mother speak of the garden and of a daughter she missed. She came with no proselytizing promise and with a watchful tenderness that unsettled me, because it did not ask for anything in return. It did not demand I accept a belief before receiving help. It only offered care. I watched the doctor stitch my mother's side, and felt a shame I hadn't recognized before. It was a shame that had nothing to do with the illness, and everything to do with the idea that our dignity had been purchased by someone outside our faith. I remember thinking for the first time that kindness did not fit inside the boxes I had been taught to make. After the surgery, the doctor walked into our living room and spoke softly. "She will live if she rests," he said. "Tell me what she needs." My father's voice was thin. "We are grateful," he said, and then, because a lifetime of leading a community does not disappear in a single breath, he added, "How can we pay you?" "You do not have to pay," Sarah replied. "Just let her get well." The exchange was simple, and yet it felt revolutionary. I had been taught suspicion. The doctor taught me something else: generosity without conditions. I began to go to the clinic with excuses, questions about medicine, help with small tasks, but mostly because I wanted to understand why someone would cross the lines my life had drawn so carefully. It was Sarah who handed me the book. She wrapped it in a cloth and said, "This is for you. Read slowly. Ask me anything." "Why would you give it to me?" I asked, suspicion still at the surface. "Because you asked," she said. "Because you came." I took the book home and hid it beneath my mattress. The cover was worn and the pages smelled faintly of dust and oil. It was a small New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew folded inside. I had seen Hebrew letters and Arabic script and the calligraphy of prayer before, but this book looked different. I turned pages with a trembling curiosity. There on a page I could hardly lift, I read phrases that made my mind stumble. A sermon on a hillside about blessedness, about the poor in spirit, the gentle, the persecuted. I could not copy words from it into my mind without at least one voice in my head saying this was wrong. Someone had taught me to trust only certain texts for truth, and to treat others as suspect. But I kept reading. There was a sentence that stopped me. "Love your enemies." It sounded like a dangerous idea in a place where honor and shame commanded nearly every action. You could see how such a command could unravel communities, how forgiveness might be mistaken for weakness. Still, I read it again late at night, and it lodged in me like a splinter. The more I read, the more the neat map I had been given started to fray. The book did something I had not expected. It asked me to measure my heart against a love that did not depend on fitting in. It asked for a trust that was not about performing the right rituals to be accepted, but about a new kind of belonging. I felt an odd lightness the first time I prayed alone, the first time I said, "If you are real, meet me." It was not a thunderclap. It was quieter. It felt like a hand resting on my forehead, like breath reaching the lungs after a long dive. I did not announce it. How could I? In our house the walls had ears. The mosque's rhythm had been our metronome. To step off its beaten path was not simply a private decision. It was a public act with consequences. So I began to live two lives. I prayed with my father in the mornings, my words practiced and sure. At night I read the gospel in the quiet, under the thin glow of a lamp. I met with others, whispered secret meetings at the doctor's home where a handful of us gathered to pray quietly, to learn what it meant to follow this man who said, "Come to me, all who are weary." We were careful. We learned the language of caution. Knock on a different door. Say you are visiting a relative. There was a tenderness in those small gatherings that filled a hollow I had not known existed. Then, as always happens, what is hidden finds daylight. My younger brother, Khalid, was a restless boy with quick hands and quicker eyes. He was not cruel. He was afraid. He was less careful than I was, and, in a moment of alarmed curiosity, he found the small book I thought was safely hidden. He brought it to our father. I stood in the courtyard when my father opened the book and read the page like a man who had been struck. The lines of his face sharpened into something I had seen only twice before. The look of a man who felt betrayed by more than an action. betrayed by what he believed to be the future of his family. People gather quickly when they sense a crack in what steadied them. What was meant to be a private revelation became public in a breath. "Is this yours?" my father asked. "Yes," I said, and my voice held steadiness that surprised even me. "Renounce this," he said. That was not a request. It was the sentence of a man who knew the grammar of community law. Renounce publicly or be cast out privately. I remember the moment he struck me, not with the full force of a man who intends to maim, but with the sharpness of one who feels his world slipping. The slap was about shame more than pain. My mother covered her mouth and sobbed. Khalid stood there, his face a mask of confusion and fear. The neighbors leaned closer at their gates. Someone whispered a prayer out loud, and the sound of it was like a hammer. "I will not lie to save my life," I said. It is one thing to think you believe. It is another to say it while the world watches. There is a clarity in a public confession that I had not anticipated. When I said the words aloud, words that declared I had given my heart to Jesus, the ground in the courtyard shifted. My father's eyes filled with a grief that was impossible to misread. He loved me in a way that could not reconcile with what he saw as shame. Love and honor had become opposed things. "I cannot have you here," he said. He did not speak of punishment as if it were solely his decision. He spoke as if the village had already judged. "Leave." I left with nothing but a blanket and the book, and a heart that felt both fragile and strangely full. The doctor took us into his house without question. Sarah gave my mother tea and sat with us while the men of the village convened in the back of the shop and decided that an example must be made. It is difficult to describe the smallness and largeness of that house. It smelled of antiseptic and lemon soap. It had a dentist's chair and a metal cabinet with instruments. It had, more surprisingly, a stack of food and folded blankets. There were neighbors who had been quietly converted by kindness, and who now brought us loaves and pots of stew. There were people who held their breaths at the doorway and wept in private. The elders of the village met in the shade of a fig tree, and when they spoke, it was with the cadence of a people deciding a sentence. I was told I would be brought before the crowd. I was told that the law of honor demanded an answer. I was told that to protect the community they would need to make an example. These phrases floated around like smoke, vague, necessary, and terrible. It is strange what the human mind does in crisis. I remember being mostly aware of small things, the way the doctor's fingers moved when he wrapped my mother's wound, Sarah's quiet humming as she placed a blanket over my shoulders, Khalid's face, hollow and ashamed, pressed against my side as if to anchor himself to me. I remember thinking of the stories my grandmother told of desert nights and impossible survivals. I remembered a tale in the Bible, a story of 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who stood before a fire and did not burn. At the time, I did not say why that image came to me. I only thought of it as a distant echo in my bones. It felt both absurd and strangely comforting. Word spread faster than I imagined. It traveled like a dry wind. By evening, people who had not come to our house for years stood at the foot of the doctor's garden to watch. Some were curious. Some were hungry for retribution. Fear makes men loud. Rumors thickened. That our family had desecrated tradition, that we had sold our souls, that our shame would fall on anyone who sheltered us. The doctor stood in front of his door and told them he would not hand us over. His voice did not tremble. He did not make grand statements about the Bible or conversions. He said something simpler. "You cannot kill a man for what he believes in his heart," he said. "Bring your concerns, we will answer, but we will not give them over to violence." They threw stones at the gate. The first ones cracked against the wood with dull thunks. I felt each strike as if someone had struck my ribs. The doctor climbed onto the step and lifted his hands and said, "We will not run." From that night onward, the doctor's house became a shelter and a target. Neighbors I thought I knew took up torches and walked the paths of the village, and those who stood with us did so quietly, bringing blankets and whispering prayers. Inside, we gathered to pray in secret. I prayed with a desperation I had never known. I prayed for my mother, for my father, for my brother, for the men who had once welcomed our family for advice and weddings. I prayed that the kindness that had given us a new chance might be stronger than the fury bearing down on us. Days stretched by with an anxious thickness to them. We slept in shifts, windows bolted. The doctor and Sarah handled supplies as if they were running a small fortress. Sometimes men would come in the night, neighbors, friends from the city, bringing letters of protest, bringing contacts who might offer sanctuary. Other times there were only the sounds of distant voices, rising and falling like waves. I found myself staring at the small book until the letters blurred. I read of mountains and seeds and fishermen, and found in those images a map for a life that seemed impossible to hold in my hands. I learned about a peace that did not depend on being liked. I learned about forgiveness, the kind that requires a strength I had not thought I possessed. I also learned about cost, about a way that asks its followers to walk into loss rather than turn to the easier path of fitting in. On one of the evenings, while the house trembled with whispers and footsteps outside, my father came to the gate. He had not come alone. He stood like a man carrying the weight of a decision more than any anger. He looked at the doctor, and then at the doorway, then down at the ground where I slept beneath a thin blanket. "What do you think you are doing?" he asked, not with the voice of a judge but of a father who still felt his son slipping away. "I am following what I believe," I replied. "You have disgraced your family," he said, and you could hear how he tried to say it without breaking into a cry. "You gave me life," I said. "You taught me to fear what could harm the soul. I am not denying what you taught. I am saying that my soul has found something in another place. I cannot undo that." My father's face broke then, like something made of pottery, dropped and cracked but not shattering entirely. He lowered his head and walked away. It was a small thing and a large thing. The village took the movement as a signal. A man who leads has declared his son unfit. People do not remain neutral for long when honor is involved. They came in waves after that. First the neighbors, then the elders, then men from villages nearby. The scholarly men spoke of law and precedent. The younger ones with torches spoke of cleaning up, a stain. The house filled with people who supported us, the doctor's friends, a few who had been quietly transformed by acts of mercy, and those who simply could not abide violence. But it only takes a few voices to set a crowd on a course. When they first batter the gate, no one knows what will happen. Inside, we held our breath. I found I was not afraid of pain in the way I had been. I was more afraid of losing the thread of what had become true to me. I thought of my mother's hands, of the way she had once braided my hair, of her voice humming a lullaby. I thought of my brother's face at the doorway, and I thought of my father alone in the courtyard. The choices I had made had names and faces. They were not abstractions. The mob's rhythm increased, stones against wood, voices rising. The doctor stood like a thin column, refusing anything less than reason. He spoke calmly. "Bring me your complaints. Let us discuss. Do not break us." That calmness was not a weakness. It was like a stone placed in a river to slow the torrent. But stones can be moved. They broke the gate in the late afternoon. A man with a rope stepped forward. I could hear someone call for the square. The voice of the elders carried the finality of a sentence. The doctor stepped between me and them and said, "You will not drag him from my house." The rope was pulled. Men moved in. I felt hands on my shoulders and then a violent dragging across the courtyard to the street beyond. I did not resist. Resistance was not bravery, it was vanity in that moment. I had already chosen where I stood. I had chosen a name for my life, and I would not plead to be allowed to keep a life I no longer claimed. As they pulled me through the crowd, I saw faces, some firm with judgment, others oddly softened, some eyes not quite certain what they had become. A man I had once tutored in recitation spat into the dust. An old woman folded her hands and wept. Khalid watched from the doorway like a statue carved by grief. They bound me to the post at the center of the square. They poured gasoline again. The scent was thick and metallic, and the sun beat down as if it wanted to finish the job of scorching the world into its appointed shape. Voices blended into a high, unending chant. For a moment everything was very, very clear. I closed my eyes. I did not feel the heat yet. I felt the presence I had begun to trust, the one that had calmed the small storms in my heart. It was not anything I could measure with my hands. It was the memory of a hand laid on my forehead the night I prayed and felt something answer. It was the echo of a sermon that said not to repay evil with evil. I remembered the story of 3 men who walked into a fire and walked out untouched. I remembered being told to bless those who curse. The old words came back not as commands but as company. They struck a match. The air flared. The flame tasted like the end. I thought of my mother's hands. I thought of Sarah's smile. I thought of my father's silence. I thought of the little book beneath my mattress. I thought of the man, the one called Jesus, who had turned bread into hope for others and had told stories about shepherds leaving 99 sheep to find one lost. I had chosen a life because of an encounter with mercy. If fire was to be the cost, then so be it. But there was a difference now. The fear that once lay so heavy in my chest had lifted in a way I could not have described before. I stood with my eyes closed and whispered, "I trust you." The flame caught. The crowd leaned forward. The heat came like a wall. My skin prickled. But what happened next was not what they expected. The flame took, and for a heartbeat the square became one bright wall. The air changed, thick and roaring and alive. People leaned forward like a crowd at an animal. The noise rose to a single animal sound. I expected pain to come like an avalanche. Instead, something else arrived. Heat rolled over me, but it did not bite. It licked, it pressed, it sang at the edge of my skin, and my skin did not sear. The rope dug into my wrists. The smell of gasoline grew raw. But beneath all that, under the crackle of flame, there was a presence. Nearer than thought, closer than blood. It was like someone had put both hands on my shoulders and then stepped back so I could feel the imprint. It was not a light that blinded me. It was a steadiness that held me upright. I opened my eyes and saw the flames not as an enemy, but as a curtain that did not touch me. Men recoiled. Their shouts faltered. I remember thinking absurdly of the kitchen fires at our house, of pans left unattended, of the way heat can teach you to move fast. This heat asked for no movement from me. I felt strangely wide and small at once. Wide because something had taken up space for me. Small because there was nothing I could claim except a whisper of thanks. Around me, the crowd shifted from fever to confusion. A young man near the post clapped both hands over his mouth and stumbled backward, eyes huge. One of the men who had poured the fuel looked down at his own hands, as if they belonged to someone else. Old faces that had scorned me a moment before now looked as if they were trying to read a dream. The doctor, he who had stood at his gate, had climbed a low step and stood with a hand over his mouth, his jaw slack. Sarah was behind him, white-faced. For a beat no one moved. Then a sound rose that I will never forget. A single sob, not loud, but it broke the held collective breath and turned silence into a tide. It started from the back of the crowd and spread like a tremor. Not anger, not joy, just a raw human sound unsure what to be. A woman in a black scarf fell to her knees, hands lifted to the sky the way I had seen my mother lift them when she prayed for rain. Someone began to whisper, "Allah," and stopped as if the word was both needed and inadequate. I tried to speak. My throat felt like paper. Instead of words, a memory pressed into me. A story my grandmother had told about 3 men who had been thrown into a blazing furnace and had another with them. I thought of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, not as proof, not as a claim to be equal to their witness, but as a strange and tender companion to my bewilderment. I remembered the pages of Matthew I had read about saying no to repayment with harm, about loving when the instinct is to hate. None of these were neat answers. They were echoes that gently attuned my heart to something beyond this square. One of my captors, a man I had once tutored in the basics of recitation, fell to his knees as if pulled by a weight. "He is not burning," he breathed. "He is not burning." His voice was small and raw. Around him the murmurs turned to questions. "What is this?" someone demanded. "Sorcery?" another guessed. Fear breeds guesses. The elders pushed forward, wanting certainty more than mercy. "It's trickery," a thin voice said, loud enough to be a command. "They hide oil. They use salts. They use smoke to confuse." Accusation rose like a counterflame, but there were too many witnesses now to make a single explanation stick. Some of the men stepped back. Others, less certain, kept their torches lit as if illumination would force truth out. The doctor moved. He did what he had done before. He stood where conflict might be and refused to let it become worse. He shouted to the crowd, not with sermons but with a question. "Did any of you ask for a man to die? Did any of you demand this?" His voice carried. "Do you want blood? Will blood bring back what you lost? Think." Those words did not cool the mob, but they planted a hesitation. For a man who had once been content to do the right deeds quietly, it was a small miracle to see him speak like that in public and be heard. The doctor had no shield but a small thinness of bravery that somehow bent the arc of the moment. While they argued, I felt hands again, gentle, certain, unbinding the rope. I could not tell whether it was the doctor, Sarah, or someone who had come with them. Time thinned as hands worked quickly. A knot slipped, a tie unlooped. The ropes fell away. For the first time since morning, I tasted the world as something I could move inside of. A man bent and put a blanket over my shoulders. His face was partly in shadow. He wrapped me in it and lifted me as if I were both fragile and fiercely alive. They moved me back toward the doctor's gate while the crowd argued like flint and steel. Someone hurled a rock that struck the ground near my head. It missed, but the sound echoed and shook my bones. They shoved me through the gap between men and gate and pulled the blanket closed. Inside, under the lemon-scented air, people breathed hard and fast. Sarah found cool water and poured it on a cloth, pressing it to my face. The water smelled of soap and something like herbs. I felt tears on my cheeks. Some were from fear, some were because the moment finally let out. They cleaned the fuel from my skin with gentleness that baffled me. There were no burns to dress, only the sticky residue of oil and the little pinch of where rope had cut. The doctor bent over me with a hand on his knee and asked softly, "Are you hurt?" "Hurt?" I repeated. Hurt was a wide word now. I thought of all the ways I had been wounded, the losing of place in my family, the scorn. I thought of the ache in my mother's chest before the doctor took his knife. I thought of the loneliness that had driven me to the book under my mattress. "I am here," I said. "I am alive." The days that followed were an odd tangle of relief and new fears. The village did not forget. Men in the square kept talking as if they had to choose what to be now that their certainty had been stripped. Some stopped coming to the mosque for a week, scared that their understanding of the world was fragile. Others tried to speak louder to fill space that felt empty. In the evenings, when the crowd had dispersed, a few men came quietly to the doctor's gate and set down fruit or bread. They would not meet our eyes. And then there were unexpected visits. People who had watched the square and found their hearts moved to something like belief, or at least to curiosity. One of them was a woman who had once shouted the loudest for my punishment. She came to the gate with her face veiled and left a small pot of stew and a handkerchief folded with trembling fingers. She would not speak to me at first. She left offerings and walked away. Later she came again and stood in the doorway and said nothing for a long time. "I saw something," she whispered. "I cannot explain it." Others were less tender. My father spoke only through the gate once, his voice thinner each time. "You have chosen a path that breaks us," he said. There was shame in him, yes, but also fear. Fear, I learned, is a close cousin of love in many forms. Some of the men who had been present in the square stopped by later and spoke in low tones about what they had seen. A few confessed. They had come in anger and left confused. One by one, secrets that had been held in the dark found small daylight. A teenager who had torched his own shirt that night came weeks later to the clinic and simply asked if he could help with fetching water. He stayed around, embarrassed at his fear, and over time began to come to the quiet meetings. There is no dramatic conversion for many of these people, only a slow unwinding of certainty and the awkward stitching back of a life that will be different. The story of that afternoon traveled beyond our village. Word reached the city. Through traders, travelers, letters folded and sent in the pockets of men who had always listened for gossip. People in the city church met and decided there needed to be a safe route for those at risk. The doctor and Sarah, who had been ordinary people with a car and an open door, suddenly found themselves part of a network that they had only once glimpsed on paper. It was decided that I should go to the city for a time. It was not safe to remain. The doctor found a driver who would take me with a load of goats to avoid suspicion. Sarah sat in the back of the truck and kept her hand on my knee the whole bumpy way. We rolled away before dawn. The hills were blue and the air smelled of dew. I watched the village slip by, the narrow paths, the fig tree, the mosque's thin minaret that had been my map for so long. I felt grief prickle like small hands in my chest. I thought of my brother Khaled and of my mother, who was recovering in a house now less tempered by anger than sorrow. In the city, I was given a small room in a house that hummed with voices in many languages. There were others there, young men and women who had left because they could not live under the yoke of shame, some because they had been discovered, some because they had been beaten and had no choice. We ate together, we washed one another's clothes, we told stories in whispers. None of us had a script for what came next. We stitched a life from day-to-day kindnesses. They baptized me a few weeks later in a small pool behind a house where water warmed with the sun. It was not a spectacle. We kept it small because there were dangers even then. The doctor stood at the edge, hands clasped. Sarah wept quietly, wiping her cheeks as if it were something private. My brother did not come. My father would not. A few of the men who had been at the square were there, quiet now, eyes on the water. When I came up out of that water, cold and laughing, they clapped with hands that trembled. Baptism did not make everything right. It did not rewrite what had been done. The loss of the life I had known remained a real thing. I missed my father's voice in a way that hurt like old wounds. I worried for Khaled. How would he live under the weight of our house's shame? The doctor arranged for my mother to come to the city after she was strong enough. She arrived like a bird that had flown from a storm. She did not embrace my faith loudly, but she sat in the kitchen and watched me handle bread and water with new memory. We ate together in a way that felt like hope trying on garments. Over time, as news spread and more people heard the story, some who had seen the square came forward and whispered their questions. A small group began meeting in that same city room, men and women who had something to overcome. We talked about what it meant to follow a man who said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and what it meant when following him cost your family. We read Matthew slowly, not as a battleground but as a map. We learned to pray without fancy words, and to show mercy in small acts. A bowl of soup, a bandage, a word for someone in the marketplace. The rescue that the title of this story suggests, from flames to faith, was not a single moment that covered everything. The rescue was many small things woven together. There was the physical rescue that kept me from the blaze. There was the rescue of a conscience from the trap of honor that made love conditional. There was rescue in the doctor's refusal to trade mercy for power. There was rescue in a community that, quietly and imperfectly, took in the cast-offs and learned to be the family they had been afraid to become. One of the strangest aftermaths was the way forgiveness took shape. People imagine forgiveness as a single big magnanimous act. In my experience, it was more like stitching, small, repeated, sometimes clumsy stitches that eventually became something whole. I prayed for the men who had dragged me into the square. I prayed for my father. I whispered to God the things my throat couldn't say out loud. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It did not mean condoning actions. It meant I would not let their violent choices define the limit of who I could be. It meant I would not become what I had been shown by pain. Months later, a letter arrived from my father. He wrote in uneven hand, the ink blotched in places where the pen had hesitated. He did not speak about the book or the square. He wrote of the garden and of a small fig tree he had planted when I was a boy that had finally borne fruit. He wrote that he had been to the edge of the well and had thought of me. He did not ask me to return. He did not seek to convince me otherwise. He asked only that I remember the house that had made me. That letter was the beginning of conversation. It was also a reminder that people are complex. Love and shame can live in the same heart. As the months turned into years, small things multiplied. A few of the men who had been in the square quietly began to attend the little meetings. Not all admitted it to their neighbors. Some still wore the armor of a public life that would not understand. Others came because they had questions they could not carry alone. We would open the gospel and someone would read aloud in a voice that shook. We would talk about the man who told stories about shepherds leaving 99 sheep to find one lost. We would pray. We would argue at times about how to live faithfully without violence, about how to protect those in danger. Those arguments were part of the mending. I found a calling in walking toward others like me. I began to travel quietly to villages where news had not yet traveled kindly, to speak in small groups about what it meant to follow Jesus and the cost such a path might bring. I taught men and women how to read the New Testament in their own tongue, not as an imperial text, but as a tender and disruptive voice. We learned first aid and how to hide those at risk. We organized safe houses and created a network of friends who could drive someone to safety at a moment's notice. None of this was glamorous. It was the slow, careful work of keeping people alive and teaching them how to live a faithful life that might one day bear fruit. Along the way, there were conversions. Not enormous crusades, but quiet, private turnings. A man who had come to see the square as proof of his righteousness later told me through a whisper that something in the way we had refused to return, hatred with hatred, had spoken to the hollow in his chest. He accepted faith like a man accepting a hand when he had stopped expecting one. Another, young and angry, the very one who had poured the fuel, came to a meeting, tearing at the hem of himself like someone waking up from a nightmare. His conversion was messy, painful, and full of weeping. He did not ask for absolution. He asked how to live different. I never claimed that the miracle at the post would be repeated for everyone. I wrote that down early in the days after the square because people asked, as people often do, for rules and guarantees. I refused to give them. Some who follow this path suffer in ways that do not end in rescue or escape. Some are not spared. Our faith does not rest on a formula that promises physical safety. It rests on a person, Jesus, who walked into suffering himself, who never promised his followers a life without hardship, but who promised to be present within it. That presence does not mean we will never burn. It means we do not burn alone. There were times when grief struck me like a hard winter. I would dream of the square and wake with a salt taste in my mouth. I would cry for the mother who had been so gentle in her asking, for the friends who had turned, for the men who had felt their honor threatened. I learned to mourn without letting grief sink to bitterness. The people who sat with me in those hard nights, Sarah, the doctor, the other converts, became my family. We prayed and we laughed and we sometimes ate food that tasted of distant homes. Years later, standing at a small gathering in the city where we trained people to be ready to help others in danger, I told the story again. I spoke of the gasoline and the post, of ropes and the crowd. I told them of the silence that fell when the flames came and did not take me. I told them about the doctor who would not hand us over. I told them about the woman who later left the pot of stew. People listened with their heads bowed, and some took notes for the practical parts, the safe routes, the letters of aid. But mostly they listened because the story is not only a manual for rescue, it is a map for a way of living in a world that asks hard things of those who would follow mercy. At the end of the talk, an old man approached. He told me he had been one of those who had shouted in the square. His voice cracked. "I did what I thought was right," he said, "but I was wrong." He took my hand and wept. His tears were not about law, but about sight. "You lived," he said. "You are proof that we are not bound to our fears." Not everyone changed. My father never publicly declared himself a follower. He called sometimes. His voice was softer. Once, when I returned for a short visit under careful cover, he stood at a distance and watched me as I spoke to a young man about keeping a hidden life safe. He did not approach. At dusk, he came forward and left a bowl of figs on my lap without looking at me. We did not speak of doctrine that night. We spoke of the fig tree he'd planted years before, and how it had finally borne fruit. He admitted, in the way fathers often do, that seeing me live had unsettled him in ways he could not put into words. We are still piecing those moments together. My mission did not become a public crusade. It was quiet, relational, and often risky. We learned to measure courage not by big acts, but by daily faithfulness, by a nurse who refused to turn someone away, by a teacher who kept a child who was at risk, by a baker who hid a letter in his bread. The network was a tapestry of small mercies. Looking back now, the arc from flames to faith is not linear. It is not a neat before and after picture. The flames taught me about fragility and presence. They revealed the truth that life could be taken, and yet something in me had already been given that could not be burned. The faith I found was not an escape from pain, but a presence within it. Rescue for me was not only the absence of burning that day, it was the presence of hands that would not let me down afterwards. A doctor's hands that refused to chair me down to the mob, Sarah's hands that poured water on my face, the hands of strangers who brought food, and the hands of friends who taught me how to live with the cost. If I have learned anything to share with you, it is this: mercy moves. It moves in small, steady acts. Sometimes it appears dramatically. Sometimes it is as quiet as a hand covering a face with water. When mercy is offered without strings, it can disarm a crowd. When someone risks themselves for another, it creates a place where faith can take root. But mercy is also costly. The cost might be exile. It might be the rupture of old ties. It might be nights of fear. The call is not to chase rescue as a guarantee, but to align with a life that honors those who suffer, who shelter the vulnerable, and who risk to keep them safe. I do not pretend my story resolves every question. There are still nights I wake with the memory of the square. There are still moments I ache for what has been lost. But there is also a persistent peace that was not there before, a peace that hums in ordinary moments. When I help someone read a page of the gospel, when a former enemy lays a hand on my shoulder and says he wants to learn, when a child I once tutored reads without fear, that peace is not the absence of consequence. It is the presence of a companion who has been with me in the fire. From flames to faith, those words are not only a headline, they are my life. They are the movement from the heat of a public sentence to the quiet warmth of being held by a truth that would not let me perish alone. They are the story of how an ordinary doctor and his wife, with no political agenda and no desire to conquer, chose to show up and love. They are, finally, the story of a man who was taught one map and chose to follow another, knowing the cost and deciding it was worth it. If my story touches you, if it unsettles or comforts you, please remember this one practical thing. Persecuted believers, people who risk everything for faith, need more than stories. They need prayer, they need awareness, and they need support. If you want to help, consider learning about the ministries that quietly shelter and support those at risk. Share this story with someone who needs to see that mercy still moves. Join a list that prays for those who cannot speak publicly. Your attention is not neutral, it is a kind of shelter. Visit the link in the description to find ways to pray, to give, and to stand with those who are vulnerable.